December 20th, 1943, 22,000 feet above Germany. A dying B-17 bomber, torn apart by flak and fire, drifted alone through the clouds. Inside, the crew were barely conscious, one man steering, one praying, one already gone. And then from the mist, a shadow appeared, a German fighter, closing in. The gunner tried to lift his weapon, but it was frozen in blood. Everyone knew what came next, but instead of the rattle of machine guns, there was silence. The enemy pilot pulled alongside, so close they could see his face. And in that moment, over the heart of Nazi Germany, one man made a choice that defied the entire war. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Charlie Brown could barely feel his hands. Frost clung to his oxygen mask, and the cold bit through his flight suit like broken glass. The fortress, code-named Ye Old Pub, had been torn apart by flak and fighter fire. Its nose was shattered, one engine burned out, and the tail gunner was gone. The intercom crackled with half-dead voices, men trying to stay conscious, trying to stay alive. Charlie pressed his gloved palm against the controls, steadying the trembling plane. The altimeter needle dropped fast. He could hear the wind screaming through holes in the fuselage, the rattle of loose metal, the faint groans of his wounded crew. "Hold on, boys," he whispered, though no one could hear him. "Hold on just a little longer." They'd just bombed Bremen. It was supposed to be another daylight raid, heavy resistance expected, but nothing they hadn't faced before, until the German flak batteries found their range. The first hit tore open the nose section. The second ripped through the wing. Then came the fighters, 10 of them, maybe more, FW-190s and Messerschmitts diving from the sun. For 15 minutes, Ye Old Pub became a flying coffin. The gunners fought back with what little ammo they had left, hitting one or two before being silenced. When the smoke cleared, the sky was empty. But so was their defense. The bomber was alone, losing altitude, bleeding oil, and drifting deeper into enemy territory. Charlie's co-pilot, Spencer Luke, slumped forward, blood on his collar. The radio operator lay motionless. Only the tail gunner's voice was missing entirely. His compartment had been obliterated. The men were barely alive, half frozen and deafened, but Charlie refused to bail. He'd promised he'd bring them home. Below, the German countryside stretched wide and white under winter haze. Villages dotted the landscape like tiny islands of smoke. Somewhere down there, anti-aircraft guns waited. He trimmed the plane, coaxing it to climb, but the fortress groaned like a dying animal. "Come on, baby," he muttered. "Don't quit on me now." Then, through the shattered window, he saw it. Movement in the clouds. A flash of silver. A single aircraft closing in fast. Charlie's stomach turned to ice. He knew the silhouette instantly. A Messerschmitt Bf-109. Sleek, deadly, the executioner's blade of the Luftwaffe. He glanced at the dead gun switches. No ammo, no chance. The German fighter leveled beside the bomber, so close Charlie could see the black crosses on its wings and the pilot's leather helmet. For a long moment, neither man moved. Franz Stigler sat in the cockpit of his Messerschmitt, eyes locked on the crippled fortress. He'd just refueled after a skirmish when he spotted the straggler limping home. It was the easiest kill imaginable. A wounded bomber, engines sputtering, no escort in sight. His hand tightened on the trigger. One burst, he thought, one pull, and it's over. But then he saw the tail, half gone. He saw the gunners, unmoving. He saw the glass nose, blown open, the crew slumped and bleeding inside. Through the torn metal, he glimpsed a young pilot still fighting the controls, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Something inside Stigler shifted. His instructor's voice echoed in his head. "You fight with honor, Franz. Not hatred. If I ever hear you shoot a man in a parachute, I'll kill you myself." This wasn't combat. This was execution. He eased his finger off the trigger. The wind howled between them, carrying no sound but the groan of damaged engines. The two planes flew wing to wing, the bomber crawling forward, the fighter hovering beside it like a silent guardian. Inside Ye Olde Pub, the waist gunner stirred and saw the Messerschmitt. He screamed into the intercom, "Enemy fighter, 2 o'clock." Charlie barely turned his head. He expected cannon fire, the final burst that would finish them. But it didn't come. The German just stayed there, steady and close. Then, astonishingly, he gestured, pointed downward. "Is he waving us down?" the navigator croaked. Charlie blinked through cracked goggles. The German pilot's gestures were deliberate, urgent, pointing toward the sea, the direction of England. Home. "He wants us to go west," Charlie said slowly. "He's showing us the way." The others stared in disbelief. It made no sense. The enemy never helped. But the Messerschmitt stayed close, guiding them through flak zones, banking whenever the bomber drifted off course. At one point, German ground guns spotted the crippled fortress and opened fire. Stigler immediately dove between the guns and the bomber, signaling with his wings, daring them to cease. The gunners hesitated. They thought it was one of their own protecting a German plane. The flak stopped. For 10 minutes, maybe more, they flew together through the winter clouds, hunter and prey, enemies, and yet not. When they reached the coast, the grey expanse of the North Sea spread out before them. Franz knew he couldn't follow further. If his superiors ever discovered what he'd done, he'd face a firing squad. He looked once more at the shattered bomber beside him. The pilot turned, their eyes met through frost-covered glass. In that instant, words didn't matter. Both men understood. Stigler saluted, a small, respectful motion. Charlie, stunned, raised his own trembling hand in return. The German rolled his plane gently to the left, peeled away, and disappeared into the mist. Silence filled the cockpit. The only sound was the ragged breathing of men who realized they were still alive. "Did that just happen?" the navigator whispered. Charlie nodded slowly. "Yeah, it happened." They limped across the sea, engines coughing, the bomber shaking apart with every mile. When they finally reached the English coast, the landing gear jammed, forcing Charlie to crash land on a frozen field near an RAF base. The plane slid, skidded, and came to a stop in a shower of mud and ice. The medics arrived within minutes. They pulled the crew from the wreckage, shivering, bleeding, half alive. As the others were carried away, Charlie stayed in the cockpit a moment longer. The cold wind whipped through the broken glass, but he didn't feel it. He looked out at the empty sky, half expecting to see that Messerschmitt there again, waiting. But the sky was silent. He whispered to himself, "Thank you, whoever you are." That night, while the crew slept under heavy blankets, Charlie wrote the incident in his logbook. But the officers removed it the next morning. "No record," they said. "No one will believe it." But he kept the memory anyway, tucked behind medals and orders as the only proof that mercy still existed in the middle of hell. Across the front lines, Franz Stigler flew again the next day. He shot down 2 enemy fighters and returned without celebration. The men cheered. He didn't smile. In the quiet of his quarters, he opened his journal, stared at the blank page, and wrote just one sentence: "I could not shoot." He closed the book and whispered a prayer. For the strangers in the sky, for the world that had forgotten mercy, and for himself that he might never lose what humanity he had left. Neither man knew they would meet again, not as enemies, but as brothers. The war didn't end that night. The bombs kept falling, the missions kept flying, and both men kept fighting, each in his own way. In England, Lieutenant Charlie Brown's squadron repaired, regrouped, and returned to the skies. His superiors ordered him to keep silent about the incident. "The men need hatred," one commander said, "not confusion." They feared that telling the story of a German pilot showing mercy might soften their edge, blur the line between enemy and friend. Charlie didn't argue. He nodded, saluted, and flew his next mission like the rest. But in the quiet hours, when the engines stopped and the world went still, he couldn't shake the image of that Messerschmitt flying beside him. The pilot's calm eyes behind the canopy glass, the hand raised in salute. Every time he saw tracer fire light up the night, he thought of that face. Every time he ordered his gunners to fire, he wondered who was sitting on the other side of the sky. He was only 21 years old. The war had turned him into an old man long before his time. In Germany, Franz Stigler's war grew darker. His squadron was nearly destroyed by 1944. The airfields that once roared with engines now smoldered in ruin. He watched friends vanish into fireballs, one after another. The Luftwaffe was dying, and yet, each time he climbed into his cockpit, He remembered that frozen December morning, the wrecked bomber, the wounded crew, the moment he had looked into his enemy's eyes and seen not hate, but fear. He knew what it meant to be helpless. He'd seen too many die with no mercy given. Once, a younger pilot in his unit joked about shooting down parachutes for sport. Franz struck him so hard the boy's nose broke. "That is not who we are," he growled. "Not ever." By 1945, both men were done with killing. Charlie finished his tour, returned to the United States, and buried himself in training new pilots. He married, built a small house, and tried to forget. But every Christmas, the same dream came. The silver Messerschmitt appearing out of the mist, flying wing to wing beside his crippled bomber. He'd wake drenched in sweat, whispering, "Thank you." Franz, now grounded, watched his homeland crumble. Cities burned. His younger brother was killed on the Eastern Front. His commanding officer, the same man who had once spoken of honor, hanged himself rather than surrender. When the Allies came, Franz was captured. The Americans treated him fairly, even respectfully. He ate warm food, slept in a real bed for the first time in months. The guards didn't mock him. They offered cigarettes, even conversation. It confused him, the same confusion Charlie had once felt in reverse. "They are not devils," he wrote in his notebook. "They are men, just like us." The war ended. The world moved on. Both men tried to live as if it hadn't happened. Charlie became an instructor. Franz worked odd jobs, then emigrated to Canada in the 1950s, starting over as an engineer. They didn't know it yet, but the same sky that had once joined them in war would someday reunite them in peace. For 40 years, they lived separate lives, two old soldiers carrying the same invisible story. Charlie told his children vague bits, calling it a strange thing that happened in the war. He never gave details. No one would have believed them anyway. In 1986, long after most of the world had forgotten, Charlie attended a pilot reunion in Florida. He gave a short speech about honor and mercy. When he mentioned a German pilot who had spared him, the room went silent. "Did you ever find him?" someone asked. Charlie shook his head. "No, I tried. I don't even know his name." The veterans magazine Combat Flyer ran a small story about it that winter. It was only a paragraph. An anonymous American bomber pilot spared by an unknown German ace. But somewhere across the border, in a quiet house in Vancouver, a retired man opened that issue, read the words, and froze. Franz Stigler put down the magazine, his hands trembling. He whispered aloud, "He lived." For years he had wondered. He had never told anyone what he'd done. In Nazi Germany, mercy was treason. If anyone had known, he'd have been shot. But now, reading the story, he realized the man he spared had survived and was looking for him. Franz wrote a letter. He kept it simple. "Dear Lieutenant Brown, I am the man you met over Germany in December 1943. I saw your bomber, and I could not shoot. I am glad you lived. Maybe we can meet one day. Franz Stigler." He mailed it, not knowing if it would ever reach him. 3 weeks later, in Florida, Charlie came home from work and found a letter on his doorstep. The return address said, Vancouver, Canada. The handwriting was unfamiliar. He opened it, read the first line, and sat down hard in his chair. His hands shook as he read the rest. His wife came running. "Who is it?" she asked. Charlie looked up, tears in his eyes. "It's him," he whispered. "It's the German." They spoke on the phone that night. The moment Franz said his name, Charlie's voice broke. "I've thought about you for 40 years, he said. "So have I," Franz replied softly. "Every day." They agreed to meet. In June 1990, at an airfield in Washington, two old men stood face to face for the first time since that frozen day in 1943. Charlie, in his 70s now, thinner but still carrying a pilot's posture. Franz, white-haired, in a suit and tie. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Charlie reached out his hand. Franz took it. They stood like that for a full minute. Then Charlie pulled him into an embrace. "I never got to thank you," he said. "You gave me my life." Franz shook his head. "No," he replied, "you gave me mine, because if I had shot you, I would have lost my soul." Reporters captured the moment, cameras clicking, but neither man noticed. They sat together afterward for hours, talking, laughing, crying. They showed each other family photos, wives, children, grandchildren. The men they had once been seemed far away, like ghosts seen through clouds. That night Charlie wrote in his journal, "I met the man I feared most, and found my brother instead." Their friendship became something beautiful and strange. They called each other weekly, celebrated birthdays together, even vacationed with their families. Charlie's grandchildren called Franz Uncle Franz. When they appeared together at veteran events, the crowd always fell silent, sensing they were witnessing something rare, a living monument to humanity in the middle of war. In one interview, Charlie was asked what he saw that day in 1943. He smiled faintly and said, "I saw God in the eyes of my enemy." Franz's answer was simpler. "I saw a man I couldn't kill. When they were old and tired, they made a pact to be buried in the same cemetery, side by side, like wingmen who never left formation." In the years that followed, their story began to travel far beyond them, first through veteran circles, then across the world. But to Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler, it was never about glory. It was about a single choice, made high above the earth, that redefined what it meant to be human in war. They met often, sitting for hours with coffee between them, their conversations drifting between laughter and silence. Sometimes they spoke of the past, of the smell of oil and gunpowder, of frost clinging to metal, of the long, endless roar of engines. Other times they simply sat and said nothing at all, because there was nothing left to explain. They both knew that something sacred had happened that day. At one of their reunions, Charlie brought a small piece of metal wrapped in cloth. He set it on the table and unwrapped it. It was a fragment of Ye Olde pub, salvaged from the wreckage decades earlier. The aluminum was dull and scarred, but the edges still shimmered faintly under light. "You saved this?" Franz asked. Charlie nodded. "I couldn't throw it away. It's a reminder that mercy can be stronger than steel." Franz smiled, tracing the rough surface with his thumb. "You see that scar?" he said. "That's where the bullets missed." The room fell quiet again, as if both men were listening to the faint hum of an engine long gone. Years later, when their story became public through books and documentaries, people often called it a miracle of mercy. But for the men who lived it, it was simpler than that. It was the moment when two soldiers decided that honor meant more than victory. At a veterans event in 2004, someone asked Franz what he thought about war after all those years. He paused for a long time before answering. "War teaches you to kill," he said quietly. "But sometimes it gives you one chance to remember that you don't have to." He looked out over the crowd, rows of uniforms, medals gleaming under light. "That day," he continued, "I didn't save a plane. I saved myself." The room erupted in applause, but Franz only nodded humbly, folding his hands in his lap. Charlie placed a hand on his shoulder, their bond wordless but unbreakable. As the years wore them down, their health began to fade. Charlie's hearing weakened, Franz's vision dimmed, but they still called each other every week, like clockwork. Every time, Franz answered the same way. "Ah, my brother, you still up there?" Charlie laughed, coughing through his age. "Still flying, old man." When Charlie's wife passed away in 2006, Franz flew in for the funeral. He stood beside the coffin, his hands clasped, his eyes closed. He had been to many funerals, but this one felt different. He was saying goodbye to the last piece of the world they had shared, a world that had taught them the value of compassion the hardest way possible. 2 years later, in March 2008, Franz passed away in Vancouver at the age of 92. When Charlie received the call, he sat in silence for a long time. "Then I guess," he said softly, "he's flying ahead now." Charlie followed later that same year. The two men, who had once faced each other as enemies at 22,000 feet, were buried side by side, their graves marked only by their names, their service, and a single inscription shared between them. "My enemy, my brother." Today, their story is taught in flight schools, military academies, and classrooms around the world. Not as a tale of tactics or technology, but as proof that even in the darkest skies of war, light can still find a way through the clouds. Visitors often come to their resting place, young pilots, veterans, and families who've heard the legend. They stand between the two headstones and imagine that December morning. The thunder of engines, the smell of oil and smoke, the unimaginable cold. And then, through the haze of imagination, they see it. Two planes, enemies in every sense, flying side by side through the mist. That image has become more than a photograph in history. It's a message. That courage is not only in the kill, but in restraint. That strength isn't in the hand that strikes, but in the one that spares. That even in the most brutal machine humanity ever created, war, mercy can still survive. In the final page of his wartime journal, found among his belongings after his death, Franz had written only one line. It was faded, but still legible. "No one wins by hate. We all win by grace." The ink had bled from age, but the meaning remained sharp as the day he wrote it. Charlie's own diary held a similar note, a reflection written decades later. "When I was young, I thought heroes were men who shot straighter. Now I know. They are the ones who choose not to." And so, their legacy endures, not in medals or statistics, but in something far more enduring. The quiet proof that even in a world built on destruction, mercy can still fly. The day Franz Stigler chose not to pull the trigger, he gave the world something that every bullet had tried to erase: humanity. And that, in the end, is the truest victory any man can claim.